I'm Jessica, the Museum Guide, and today I'm at the west side of Highgate Cemetery to take you on a tour of one of the most eerily beautiful places in all of London. So, welcome to Highgate Cemetery. Today we're going to explore the history of the west side of the cemetery, and I'm going to detail the grim need to build it in an ever-expanding Victorian London. Then we're going to visit some of the cemetery's most famous graves and talk all about the symbolism that you can see throughout. This video just covers the west side of the cemetery, but join me in part 2, which I'm going to release next week, of the east side, slightly more modern but just as fascinating. You can see Karl Marx, Douglas Adams, and many other notable graves. Before we continue, I want to say that I am very much indebted to the Friends of Highgate for this tour, not only for ensuring that we have this peaceful cemetery to visit today, and that it wasn't developed into houses in the 70s, but also because I've taken their tour many times. I used to work with a touring company that worked in tandem with them to give tours with the east and west side. So you'll always hear me talking about how you can book private tours with me. Yes, you can book private tours with me, but may I ask, if you're going to visit Highgate Cemetery, check with the Friends of Highgate first to see if they can accommodate you. Not only are they the experts, they also raise money and are volunteer run to ensure that we can keep visiting this cemetery for many years to come. Now, as I slowly walk around the cemetery, let me tell you a little bit about the grisly history of this place. If you've watched some of my videos about body snatching, surgery, and churchyard burial grounds, it will come as no surprise that London was a brutal and smelly place in the 18th and early 19th centuries. London and other major cities were in desperate need of a way to modernize the way they dealt with human remains at a time when cremation was not only frowned upon for religious reasons, but also a legal gray area. Back then, people were buried in the churchyards of the local church, and graves were regularly reused. A lack of space meant that bodies were sometimes only buried about 3 feet deep, and the effluence seeping out of these pits of decay was making its way into the water supply, contributing to wave after wave of cholera and disease. Watch my video about the London Necropolis Railway to find out just how bad things could get. Now, forget about the body snatchers lurking around to sell fresh corpses to medical students. It wasn't the fresh corpses that were the problem, but the putrefying bodies that were frequently disturbed, dismembered, or destroyed to make room for newcomers. It was common to see disinterred bones cast aside by busy gravediggers or dug up by feral dogs. Smashed coffins were even sold to the poor for firewood. And where were the authorities? Well, clergymen and sextons turned a blind eye to the worst of the worst practices because the burials provided a large proportion of their income. Inspired by Père Lachaise in Paris, about which I will be releasing a video very soon, the London Cemetery Company was born. They hired architect Stephen Geary, buried in his own grave here at Highgate Cemetery, but sadly not accessible to the public. He designed this stunning garden cemetery where the creme de la creme of society would want to rest in their final days. As more and more London areas began forbidding churchyard burials for sanitation reasons, Highgate Cemetery and the 7 other garden cemeteries gained in popularity. Today, these are called the Magnificent Seven. The 8th, Victoria Park Cemetery, is now a park called Meath Gardens, and the gravestones were cleared. I included in my video about the strangest graveyards in London. Now, Stephen Geary had a tough needle to thread. He had to convince people that this newfangled cemetery was every bit as respectful as a monument in a church crypt or a plot in a churchyard, but he also wanted to give the place a little bit of pizzazz, which we'll see along the way in the Egyptian Avenue, the Catacombs, and, of course, the Circle of Lebanon. Now, Highgate West opened in 1839, a few years after Kensal Green and West Norwood, and we'll visit the first burial here a little bit later on. By 1854, a further 19 acres to the southeast of the original area was purchased, the east side, which we'll tour in my next video, and that opened in 1860. Over time, 170,000 people were buried here in around 53,000 graves across both the west and east. However, by the 1950s and 60s, the popularity of cremation led to financial problems, and the United Cemetery Company, which was the successors to the London Cemetery Company, they just ran out of money. The cemetery was neglected and allowed to deteriorate, and in 1975, it finally closed. We're going to see evidence of this neglect throughout, but today it's once again a very desirable place to be buried. New graves are added, which we'll see, and there might even be some more sometime soon. That's right, plans have been approved for some of the unused or underused graves to be reopened and sold. Now, you might feel uncomfortable about that now, but wait until this tour is over to pass judgment. When you see how many family vaults are nearly empty, you might change your mind. As of June 7th, I'm finally going to be releasing my Patreon subscription. And this is a way that's going to hopefully allow me to focus even more on making videos for you guys. Please sign up if you'd like to support my channel, or you just want to get a lot of really good extra content like museum walkthroughs, tips, blogs, and even free in-person tours a couple times a year. Now let's get going and start visiting some of these graves. You can see it is rainy and gray and dark, transforming this overgrown cemetery into a verdant, lush rainforest. All of these drips make me think of footsteps coming up behind me. Slightly unsettling. This is actually the first grave that you'll encounter when you come up the stairs and enter in to the west side of the cemetery. We've left behind the land of the living and we've entered the land of the dead. Here is the grave of James Selby. James Selby was a coachman who won a really sizable bet on a race to Brighton and back. When he died, his family used some of the money that he won to splash out on a really grand monument that includes references to his profession, which is common and we'll see again and again. Here on this grave, you can see a whip and a horn right down at the front there. These were important tools of his trade. And then here on the posts, upside down horseshoes. Now, we're supposed to have horseshoes the other way up for good luck, right? So that all of the luck doesn't fall out of the bottom, or at least that's how it was explained to me as a child. But you'll notice in a lot of these monuments at Highgate Cemetery, common symbols are inverted and upside down to symbolize that they belong in this land of the dead. Now here, you can see quite a few crosses. This was rather uncommon in a large Anglican Church of England cemetery. Crosses tended to be more associated with Catholic burial grounds, and you do see a few of them, but we're going to see a lot of other symbols instead. For instance, here, even these 3 tiers below the cross, they represent hope, faith, and charity. Now let's continue walking up the path. When I used to guide tours here at Highgate Cemetery before the pandemic, there were always a lot of cats that lived in the area. I don't know if they lived here in the cemetery and were feral, or they came from other houses, but I always used to love to pet them. So maybe we'll be lucky today and see a cat, although it's raining. Cats don't tend to like the rain. I told you that crosses were a little bit uncommon. One common symbol that you'll see at Highgate Cemetery is an urn covered with a shawl. The shawl draped over the urns like this symbolizes a dividing line between life and death. Interesting to be talking about death with these happily chirping birds in the background. Now here is another magnificent memorial. This is to the Mears family, who used to own the Whitechapel Bell Foundry. That bell foundry, which operated from about 1570 until just a few years ago, is famous for casting not only Big Ben, but America's Liberty Bell. This monument is done in an ornate Victorian Gothic style, but it was really blackened and unrecognizable by the 1960s. See, by then, this cemetery had fallen out of fashion, and most British people were cremated. It went from less than 1% cremation in the 1850s to more than 75% now. So the cemetery could no longer afford gardeners and security guards, and it became nightmarishly overgrown. And we'll talk about the vandalism a little bit later on. Beautiful monuments like this one were left to decay, and tree roots grew through them, damaging graves, and there was even disturbing sights to see, body parts, which is exactly what the Victorians were trying to avoid, if you remember. Worst of all, vandals made their way in and wreaked havoc on the catacombs and destroyed a lot of graves, and we'll see more evidence of that later on. There were even rumors made up by a sensationalist media of a vampire and Satanist activities. But in 1975, the Friends of Highgate Cemetery was founded, and they kind of decided upon a mandate of creating a managed woodland instead of returning the cemetery to its pristine condition. And that's why you can see that it's been left in this beautiful forested state. It's this peaceful atmosphere rather than a manicured, pristine cemetery that you might be more used to in your home city, depending on where you're from. They raised the money to restore this monument back to its glory, but you can still see it has some kind of moss and growth on it, and I think it looks all the better for that. We're only taking a few steps away to look at another cemetery vault. Now, this vault is 25 feet deep. Yes, it's lined with brick, and it's designed to hold generations and generations of one family. However, only one woman is inside. This grave belongs to Mary Emden. She was a promising 19-year-old soprano, and her husband Walter was a young architect when she died of TB. He later on went to design some really famous theatres, some of which are in use today, like the Garrick and the Duke of York. Now, this grave uses some other symbolism. We're going to see a lot of this on the tour today. It's an empty chair that was somewhat common in the Victorian era. I remember hearing a rumor that the Albert Memorial was supposed to be an empty chair, but Victoria couldn't bear the idea of him not being present there. This is supposed to evoke her just having left the room with her shawl kind of draped on the chair. Now, why is she the only occupant here when it should be so many others, children, grandchildren? Remember, she died at only age 19, so she never had any children. And Walter, though he was very heartsick when she died and couldn't imagine finding new love, did find new love, and he remarried. And he's buried elsewhere with his wife and children and so on. Mary is all alone in this grave. Her in-laws are across the way, though. I don't know if that would be a good thing or a bad thing. It depends on their relationship. But we can see here. It's this pink granite column. By now you know that I'm fascinated by medical history. And just beyond all of these wild weeds and blackberries and poison ivy, you can see the gravestone of Dr. Frederick Akbar Mahomed, a physician and researcher who worked and lived in Brighton. His pioneering research into hypertension and nephritis led to the understanding that reducing blood pressure could improve quality of life and lifespan in general. Interestingly, he was the grandson of Bengali entrepreneur and traveller Sake-Din Mohammed, who opened the first curry house in London, the Hindustani Cafe, as well as introduced shampoo and head massage to this country. Dr. Mahomed died at just 35 of typhoid, his life filled with untapped potential like so many others here at Highgate. Now here is a doozy. Look at the size of this one for General Sir Loftus. It goes all the way up the hill, sloping downwards as you can see, and then here's the door, atmospherically covered with some algae and moss. Now here's some pictures of the inside. You can see that this mausoleum was designed so that people could actually come in and visit, which I think we would think of as being quite strange, but was quite common at the time. Now, as I mentioned, it belongs to General Sir Loftus William Otway. When the Friends of Highgate Cemetery began their restoration work, this tomb was badly in need of some TLC. The skylights were all broken and pigeons had gotten in, so the Friends spent time and a lot of money restoring it back to its grandeur. You can see it even has skylights. These were all broken and pigeons were inside. And if you know anything about ruin or demolition by neglect, you'll know that pigeons are the death knell of a building. Once they get inside, their excrement just destroys everything. But let's look at a little bit more career symbolism. Sir Loftus was a general under Wellington, and here we can see cannons. Imagine that pillar cut right in half. It would be a cannon, and dinky little cannonballs with points on the end. Personally, I think I would prefer something like natural burial, where your body, without any chemicals, embalming, or even a coffin, is just placed in some natural earth. But let me know in the comments what you think about a mausoleum like this one. Now, I barely even have to turn around to see the grave of someone who you might recognize from the media. This is a relatively recent one and very famous in the media. This grave belongs to Aleksander Litvenenko, who was known as Sasha to his friends and loved ones. You can still be buried here at Highgate. You just need the money. Now, Litvinenko was a British naturalized Russian defector who vocally criticized Putin and provided info to the British government. He was murdered in 2006 when two former Russian intelligence agents put polonium-210 into his cup of tea. Now, that was an absolutely agonizing death, but Sasha wanted the world to see it, so he allowed cameras into his hospital room at UCLH. And his wife, Marina, still continues to champion his life and legacy and fought hard for justice for his murder. They were found guilty, but the two men were never extradited from Russia. Now we can see another little bit of Victorian symbolism paired with some modern symbolism. Can you see how this column in the back, it almost looks like a Roman column here, has been sheared off? This is meant to symbolize a life cut short. And Marina chose to do a similar thing for her husband. You can see this is a much more modern style of column, but it's still sheared off in the same way. And if you stand back, you can see both of them at the same time, old and new, meeting together at Highgate. Now coming up is one that my husband actually spotted. Good eagle eyes, I knew I married him for some reason. And this is actually the gravestone to the director Christopher Nolan's father, Brendan James Nolan, who died in 2009. Of course, while the east side is more well known for more modern graves, there are modern tombstones here on the west side. Let's have a look at a few. Here's one here to artist Nikki Price. It says very much loved daughter, sister, and auntie. And she just passed away in 2009. You can see this is quite a modern, almost brutalist tombstone. And this one here, right next to it, also has a bit of artistic flair. I wasn't able to find out much about this person, but you can see here, it's for Matthew Wall. And coming in on this kind of aged copper, it says, fun and free, son, brother, and friend, magical, playful performer, irreplaceably loved. What a beautiful sentiment. And you can see it's surrounded by these Victorian graves. To prevent the problem of having so many unused family vaults and unused graves, today, if you want to purchase a plot here at Highgate Cemetery, you must either be terminally ill or over the age of 80. That's, of course, for a brand new one. Now here we have the graves of two female powerhouses, roughly of the same era, born 1927 and 1929, but very different careers. Let's start here by talking a little bit about Jane Arden. And you can see she passed away in 1982. She was a Welsh film director, actor, screenwriter, playwright, songwriter, and poet. You can see it says poet here on her headstone. And she moved here to London when she was just a teenager from Wales. She was outspoken feminist, she was anti-psychiatry activist, and she wrote a lot of subversive and experimental plays. I watched a couple shorts on YouTube of hers last night, interviewing Salvador Dali in a short experimental film. Some of her films include The Other Side of Underneath, Separation, and the wonderfully named Vagina Rex and the Gas Oven. Sadly, she took her own life at the age of 55 in North Yorkshire, but she's remembered here as a poet and so much more. Now, right next to her is Jean Simmons. Now, no, not that Jean Simmons. This lovely lady was a British actress who was nominated for not one but 2 Academy Awards. One for her role as Ophelia in the 1948 film adaptation of Hamlet, and another for her performance in The Happy Ending in 1969. She also has a lovely inscription. It says, "Swift as the light, I flew my fairy flight. Ecstatically I moved and feared no night." You can see there's some ceramic flowers and seashells here, and even a brooch. Oddly enough, when I was on the train today, a man saw that I was carrying a map of Highgate Cemetery, and he told me that he was a close friend of Jean Simmons, and he comes here to visit her sometimes. Here's another rather modern one that I didn't actually know was here. Peter Jackson, artist and London historian, Order of the British Empire. And here he's got a picture of St. Paul's Cathedral on his headstone. It says at the bottom, "Behold, behold London forever," and he was beloved husband of Valerie. That is amazing. I don't think I've actually read any of his books, but I'm going to check one out. Apparently he had a comic strip called London is Stranger Than Fiction. I'm going to put a few panels of it up right now. Oh my goodness. I mean, I really could stay here for days, but look at this beautiful memorial here. This is to Walter Hughes and family. The grave to a professor and pioneer of Chinese medicine, Man Fong Mei. Be inspired, my friend. Only in inspiration is there hope, beauty, and eternity. A positive thinker who bridged East and West with passion and generosity. Oh, and a poem as well. Beautiful. I've just spied a Jewish grave over here. As I mentioned before, you don't have to be Church of England to have historically been buried here. You can see here, this is to the Fife family. Now, I've never actually been to this next grave before because it's not featured on any of the public tours or any tours I've guided before. We're going up the Rosetti path to visit the grave of the Rosetti family. Here it is, right at the end of the path. This is the furthest part of the cemetery that the public can visit. Nothing beyond this point is open for visitors. Everywhere else that I've been, there's been people here and there, but I'm alone here, and it is really a somber and a little bit of a chilling experience to be completely alone in the gloom and the rain. Now, these graves have got to be one of my favorite stories here at Highgate. So as I mentioned, this is the Rosetti family plot. And if you recognize that name, which I've been saying a lot, it's likely because of painter Dante Gabriel Rossetti and his brother, who was a critic and writer, William. Both of them were key members of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. This late Victorian art movement extolled the virtues of the richly detailed, intensely hued early Italian Renaissance. Now, this plot contains much of the family, oddly except for Dante, who's buried at All Saints Church in Birchington-on-Sea. But back here at Highgate, this plot is home to Rosetti family patriarch, who was an Italian immigrant called Gabriel, his wife Elinor, brother William, and his wife Lucy Maddox Brown. Now, Lucy Maddox Brown was the daughter of another pre-Raphaelite artist, Ford Maddox Brown. This is also the final resting place of Sister Christina Rosetti. Now, Lucy and Christina were writers and poets in their own right, and they often modeled for painters in the movement. Christina wrote a brilliant children's poem called The Goblin Market that's still quite popular today. It tells the tale of two sisters who are tempted to buy fruit by some goblin merchants, but it's widely regarded to be quoted about lesbianism and homosexuality in general. Now, Dante's wife, Elizabeth Siddal, who is known as Lizzie, is also buried here. She was a notable model, posing for famous paintings such as John Everett Millet's Ophelia, which is at the Tate Britain. I'm planning really soon to do a top 10 paintings at the Tate Britain, so let me know which ones you'd be most interested in me including. I'm definitely going to include Ophelia. That one's a no-brainer. Lizzie was also an artist in her own right, and she was the only woman to show with the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. She was also a laudanum addict, and she struggled with her physical and mental health. She was so frail that she actually had to be carried to the church for her nuptials to Dante, even though it was just a 5-minute walk away. She had a stillborn daughter and was soon pregnant again, but in 1862, she passed away from a laudanum overdose. Some people speculate that this was intentional, and other people believe she had no intention of ending her life. In his grief, Dante placed a notebook of poems, the sole copy of these works, next to her head in the coffin, and wrapped them in her fine red hair, and then she was laid to rest in this plot. Dante completed Beata Beatrix 1 year after her death. You can see this is a really dark and brooding painting. However, 7 years later, he was feeling really tortured. Yeah, I'm sure still with some grief, but more because of the loss of that notebook, which he figured might be worth a lot of money. And this leads to one of the most infamous stories to ever take place here at Highgate Cemetery. See, his agent, Charles Augustus Howell, saw pound signs when he thought of that lost notebook. He knew the public would go gaga over that darkly gothic tale. Now, here's where accounts vary. They were accompanied by a notary and a doctor whose job was to sanitize the notebook, but they came here late one night in 1869 and exhumed Lizzie's body. Some accounts say that her long red hair had continued to grow in the coffin, and that when they opened it up, it was lushly covering the inside of the tomb, and she was fresh as when she had been buried. That her beauty was still visible, and she only began to decay once the external air hit her body. But other people say, nah, that's just a romantic story that Howell made up to sell copies of these poems, and that actually her body was exactly the way that you would imagine it would be after 7 years in her grave. Some people even say that Dante was haunted by the image of seeing his decayed love for the rest of his life. I don't know which one I believe. Ever the cynic, I'm going to go with option number 2, but the first one is a much nicer story. Now here's one that's likely to touch all of our hearts, especially if you're a fan of pop music in the 1980s. This beautiful plot, always bedecked with gorgeous, fresh white flowers and kept extremely pristine. This is the final resting place of Georgios Kyriakos Panagiotou, who you might know better as Yog. No, that was just his nickname. You probably know him better as George Michael. George Michael was an iconic and really important 1980s pop star, both with his band Wham and then later on as a more serious solo artist. And when I watched the Netflix documentary about Wham, I was expecting that maybe his former bandmate Andrew would have nasty things to say about him, breakup of a pop band, but he could only say glowing, beautiful things about his friend Yog. He really seems to have been an amazing person, though he was forced to keep his homosexuality closeted for many years. Apparently he was a very generous man and a very private man, and tragically passed away on Christmas Day. Now, why is that so especially galling? Because one of his most famous songs, of course, with Wham was Last Christmas. Every year I still do Whamageddon. What's even more tragic is that his sister passed away 3 years later on Christmas Day as well. Just behind George Michael's grave, we can actually see another little piece of common Victorian symbolism. You can see here the shaking hands, which represents a farewell to earthly life. Just a few steps away from George Michael's grave is another famous grave, a personal favorite artist of mine, Lucian Freud, the grandson of the famous psychoanalyst Sigmund. I love his paintings, especially Girl with a White Dog and Girl with a Kitten, which are portraits of his first wife, Kitty, and are also at the Tate Britain, and this portrait of iconic club kid Leigh Bowery. Lucian Freud is often associated with expressionism and surrealism, though he didn't really embrace those artistic titles. He was also an immensely private man, so I do find it a little unusual that his grave, which is this large granite slab, is so prominent and next to a pathway. You'd think it would be a little bit further out of sight, like the Rosettis. Let's continue on our walk. Here's quite a few more urns you can see with those shawls on top. Now, I wouldn't go off the path here at Highgate. First of all, it's not allowed, and second of all, it's not very respectful. Third of all, it's really dangerous. As I mentioned, roots have grown into a lot of these tombs and burial plots, and it just isn't a very smart idea to go spelunking around. But hopefully you can see about 5 meters back off the path, there's another symbol, a little bit uncommon, but of a pelican and her chicks. Is that what a baby pelican's called? This is an early Christian symbol. Now, today we know that this isn't the case, but historically, it was believed that pelicans dipped their sharp beaks into their own breast, drawing blood, and then fed their young with this blood, and therefore it became a symbol of Christian self-sacrifice. Now, today we know that that's not what's happening at all. Pelicans just have red-tipped beaks, but it's a beautiful symbol of sacrifice. Aside from just being a fascinating symbol, the pelican does actually belong to somebody notable. It's the mother of celebrated soprano Maria Caterina Caradori Allen. A mouthful. Now, a question that is commonly asked on tours like this is, do you have to take the tops off of these immense tombs in order to add more bodies to the family plot? And the answer is no. It's done a little bit differently, and you can see it here on the Price family memorial. Can you see there, even though it's got this rich rust and ochre-colored patina, it says, yes, entrance. You take this part of the slab off, and that's how you add the bodies to this tomb. You'll notice there's no sign that says exit. The door on this one is a little bit more obvious. Now we're walking further and further uphill. Remember, part of the cachet of this cemetery was that it was up on top of a hill with excellent views out over London. So not only were you showing off your wealth by having a beautiful garden cemetery, but you were literally lording over everybody else in the city. As you went higher and higher, the graves and plots got more and more expensive. Now let's make our way to another important grave. This one isn't of a famous person, but that doesn't make it any less important. We're going to find the grave of Mrs. Elizabeth Jackson, who was the very first person to be buried here at Highgate Cemetery. It's right here, and people have even left some coins as a memento. This practice is commonly done with military graves, but it can just be a way to show your respect and leave a memorial or a totem that you were there. It's often done with stones as well, and is also a common Jewish tradition. Elizabeth Jackson's interment here at the cemetery occurred on 26th May 1839. It's both a touching story, but it also helps to illustrate some of the driving factors behind the need for this cemetery in the first place. Now, I've already told you about the fact that London's graveyards attached to churches were stinking, horrible places. But I only briefly mentioned another factor that would be very troubling to loved ones, and that was the grim reality of body snatchers, or as they prefer to be called, resurrection men. Now, the Jacksons were of reasonably modest means, which is surprising when you consider how much I've emphasized the posh crowds at Highgate and the high price tag of a burial here. But Elizabeth's husband couldn't stand the idea of her being buried near where they lived in Soho. George was a bootmaker, and Soho was a pretty poor area. I know, times have changed. So how did George afford a grave in the prestigious new garden cemetery? Well, he owned his own business and did quite well for himself, but even so, this lavish purchase would have stretched his purse. Elizabeth and George had tragically lost 3 children at very young ages, and George just couldn't bear the idea of Elizabeth potentially falling prey to a body snatcher. Now, I know talking about resurrectionists can be ghoulishly fun, and we can have a bit of a giggle, but I want you to really imagine what that would have felt like as a family member. That you've said goodbye to somebody, you're in a deep sense of grief, and now you have to worry about the fact that their body may be dug up, meddled with, and cut into. Not to mention the fact that church doctrine wasn't clear on whether people who'd had postmortems could even get into heaven. George would have been deeply troubled by this, and he saved up all the money he could to buy this plot. He was later buried here with his second wife and their children. Now, I go into this topic, the body snatchers, at length in my video on the London Necropolis Railway, which I've just linked above. Now here we're walking back up this main avenue. We're entering into one of the most famous parts of Highgate Cemetery, and it's something that really sets it apart from the other members of the Magnificent Seven, the Egyptian Avenue. So there's nothing like this striking portal to the city of the dead in any other English cemetery. You could see that the avenue is set between 2 obelisks, one here and this one here, sheared off unintentionally, but isn't that quite bizarre how it mimics some of the other memorials here? You could see these lotus bud columns on either side, which really show us that this is kind of mimicking Karnak at the time, and it gives it a really obviously Egyptian feel. This is at a time in history when people in England and all over Europe had gone crazy for Egypt. Remember, this is the 1830s and 40s. After the Napoleonic Wars, so many items had been looted, brought back from Egypt by the English, the French, the German, the Italians. People were clamoring to see even more, and it was very fashionable to have Egyptian style in your home, business, and even in your cemetery. Now, the Egyptian Avenue was originally the most prestigious part of the cemetery, and it used to have a big roof, but it was considered too gloomy even for the notoriously gloomy Victorians. So the roof was removed, and then it became more popular. So you can see on either side, there's a row of 8 family vaults, each which have 8 or 12 coffins inside, or could have 8 or 12 coffins inside, but most of them are half full, if that. They come complete with heavy iron doors, and let's just inspect these doors for a minute. Here's some more symbolism. Upside down lit torches. Remember, things being upside down, not just the plot of Stranger Things, but also common in cemetery symbolism. Here's something that I think is wild. Even the keyhole is upside down. I just love these bits of symbolism. Look at the beautiful mossy green and the kind of ochre of the water, the brick exposed over time. You can accuse me of being romantic about ruin porn, but to me, the fact that this is in a state of slight disrepair makes it even more special. And being here on a rainy day means that I really have this entire place to myself. You can see the doors are going to tell people where you live. Private catacomb of Frederick Larkman Packington Street in Islington. Ooh, la-di-da. This one's even got the name of the university. He went to St. John's College at Cambridge. And here's a view of us looking down the Egyptian Avenue. As you can see, we've gone up further. And can you imagine just how dark and spooky this would be had that heavy stone roof been maintained? I am glad that they took it down. Don't let the rain scare you away from visiting places in London when you're here, because when you do visit outdoor attractions in a little bit of rain, you do get them mostly to yourself. As the Germans say, you're not made of sugar. Now we emerge out of the darkness of the Egyptian Avenue to the Circle of Lebanon. You can see still some of these same Egyptian motifs carried on, this kind of uneven door frame here, kind of a rhombus shape, and more of those upside down torches. The Egyptian Avenue and the Circle of Lebanon would have been the most desirable places to be buried here at Highgate. This is fascinating here. You can see some restoration work has taken place on this family mausoleum. But modern slate next to damaged old stone. Why is that? Why didn't they just replace the whole door? Well, because the Friends of Highgate agreed that the patina on this broken door was just too beautiful to remove. So almost like Japanese kintsugi pottery, where you fill the cracks with gold. They've kind of done the same thing here. I think it looks really beautiful. You can see we're making our way around. You can probably hear the crunching of my footsteps. That might be nice ASMR. And again, you can see the names of the family vaults at the top here. I want you to imagine in the 1950s and 60s, these doors would have been broken open, graves strewn about, even body parts visible. It was in a terrible, terrible state when the Friends took over. But we're coming up to another very interesting interment here. I don't want to say grave because this is a vault. Always fresh flowers here for Radclyffe Hall. Another plaque here for Radclyffe Hall. And if God choose, I shall love thee better after death. Una. Now, Una's not actually here. And why does this tomb then say Mabel Veronica Batten? She's here with her very understanding husband, George, and her lover, Marguerite Radclyffe Hall, who published under the name Radclyffe Hall to give her work gender ambiguity, which we'll encounter again a little bit later on the east side of the cemetery, and which we've also kind of seen with Christina Rosetti's poem. In 1907, Hall, who was a poet and a writer, met Mabel Batten, and Mabel was 24 years her senior, and they developed a relationship that lasted until Mabel's death in 1916. Mabel gave her the nickname John, which she used for the rest of her life. In 1917, Radclyffe Hall began living with Mabel's cousin, the sculptor and translator, Una Trowbridge. Remember, it says Una here on the plaque. Now, they'd met in 1915, and there was a little love triangle there. And she and Una actually felt quite guilty about what transpired in that love triangle between her, Mabel, and John. Now, Radclyffe published a book called The Well of Loneliness in 1928, which was super scandalous at the time and was banned. Today, not so much, but it features references, quite opaque ones, to lesbianism, which I can tell you without even blushing. Things like, and that night they were not parted. Things like that. But readers at the time weren't stupid. They knew exactly what Hall was referring to. And that's why the book was banned for 20 years. Now, Radclyffe Hall did not live to see it unbanned. She passed away from colon cancer in 1943. But she and Una were a couple until the end. Una wrote about the intensity of their relationship in her diary. She said, "I could not, having come to know her, imagine life without her." Now, Una died in Rome in 1963. Though she left written instructions that her coffin be placed in this vault, they were discovered too late. She's buried in the Campo Verano cemetery in Rome, and on her coffin is inscribed, Una Vincenzo Trowbridge, the friend of Radclyffe Hall. Take some flowers for her the next time you're in that marvelous city. Now, in 1994, an elderly lesbian couple raised the funds to restore this vault after it had been badly damaged by the Vandals. You can read this independent article, which I've linked below. It's really a sweet story. But let's head up these stairs for now. because until recently there was a massive cedar tree that was 230 years old on top of the circle. It actually had to be treated like a bonsai because its roots couldn't go anywhere. Just a few years ago, it had to be felled, and this little baby has started growing up in the last few years, so I think it's doing a pretty good job. One day, it will be just as imposing as its predecessor. You can't help but notice this grave when you're in Highgate Cemetery. If you saw the name George Wombwell, which is such a great name, on a map, you might not make your way to this grave. That's why taking a tour is so important, because you get to learn all about menagerist George Wombwell and his lion Nero. Now, George Wombwell started his career as a shoemaker when he went down to the docks to buy leather. He saw some snakes there and he was quite intrigued, so he bought 2 boa constrictors for £75, which was a huge sum of money back then, and he would take them around to pubs and show them off for a penny. He was soon rolling in dough and started purchasing even more animals, including a zebra, lions, tigers, hyenas, monkeys, and an elephant. He called his enterprise Wombwell's Traveling Menagerie. But did I mention that he wasn't actually very good at his job? A lot of animals died because of the English climate, and when they died, he actually found ways to make money from them. He sold them to medical schools, displayed them dead, or had them taxidermied and showed them off that way. But yeah, his niece was gored by an elephant and his nephew was killed by one of his tigers, so he really wasn't that great. Now, that said, Queen Victoria did twice view his menagerie, and on one occasion Prince Albert summoned him to come and look at his dogs because the dogs kept dying. Now, Wombwell quickly noticed that their water was poisoning them, and Albert asked, "What can I do as a favor in return?" And Wombwell requested some oak timber from the recently salvaged naval ship the Royal George, and from this ship he had his coffin fashioned, which he proceeded to display for a special fee. But that wooden coffin is inside of this magnificent tomb. Look here, someone has left a little lion puzzle piece. That's very sweet. Now, the lion up top here is Nero, who was raised in captivity and was extremely gentle and docile and wouldn't even fight dogs. George used to charge people to let their children ride on Nero's back. Based on older descriptions of the Nero marker, the friends had some chemical samples taken and found out that that lion is actually pure white marble. So why have they left it looking kind of gray and scaly? Because it's been determined that with the complexity of the carvings, the kinds of harsh acids that would have to be used to clean the lion might remove some of the detail, so they've decided to leave it as it is. Now, I'm on the hunt right now for the Dickens plot. It's not accessible to the public. It's just off this path, which is called the Dickens path, and I know it's on the left-hand side. They don't actually include it on the maps because they don't want people going to look for it and then going off-piste. You do need to stay on the paths when you're visiting Highgate Cemetery. Look at the marvelous way the roots and vines and ivy climb up all of the trees here. There's the Dickens family plot just a few steps away. We can't go right up to it, of course, because remember, we respect the rules and don't go off the path. But I did want to tell you just a little bit about the fact that his wife Catherine is buried here, as well as his younger brother, his parents, and his elder sister. I visit the Dickens Museum, which is one of the family's homes, in one of my Christmas videos that, I know it's the wrong time of year, but I'll just link it above. Oh my goodness, look at this one here. Elinor Goldschmied, our grandmother, author and early years pioneer, not a shrinking violet. And I know these aren't violets, but how fitting that she's surrounded by these little purple flowers. You definitely could have said the same thing about my own very ballsy grandmother. We actually played Girls Just Want to Have Fun at her funeral. I may not have found one of the cemetery's cats, but I did find a grave with a cat on it. Peter and Michael Desbois, the sound engineer with the Ferrari. Oh, and there's a lovely picture. And his cat. And a paw print. In the east side of the cemetery, we'll be visiting another really interesting animal grave. You can see here, now we're at the Catacombs, and from this balcony here, you used to be able to look down over all of London. In fact, you could see a lot of London's great views from a lot of places in this cemetery. Remember, a lot of these trees are self-seeded. This wasn't done intentionally, and there is a little bit of talk about pruning some of them back permanently so that the views of London return. I find it fascinating that local people could actually buy a set of keys so they could come spend some time here, even if they didn't have loved ones buried. I'm just about to enter the Catacombs, which were a very desirable place to be buried. However, this structure is not as impenetrable as it seems, and vandals did indeed break in the 60s, smashing through the skylights. Remember, the cemetery was completely out of money and couldn't afford guards or to replace glass or corroded locks. Once the vandals were inside, they broke into the coffins. As you can see here, they're all broken and banged up, and they even scattered the skeletal remains throughout the space. I mean, that's unbelievable. The Catacombs are home to one very notable resident, Mr. Robert Liston, once referred to as the fastest knife in the West End. Now, if that makes him sound like a cross between a showman and a surgeon, well, that's exactly what he was. Liston is sometimes referred to as the man behind the 300% fatality surgeon, where his patient died, his assistant later died of gangrene, and a spectator died of a heart attack. But this story is probably just spread by his detractors to give him a bad reputation. In actual fact, Liston was rather cutting edge, excuse the pun, changing out of his street clothes to perform amputations and even washing his hands. Now, this is actually impressive because this is before the germ theory of medicine, mind you. He was also the first surgeon in London to use ether during an operation, and he was the teacher of a very influential man, Joseph Lister, who would go on to revolutionize surgery. I talk all about both of them in my video about the history of surgery in London's museums, which I've linked just above. As we emerge back out of the Catacombs, which would have been the most prestigious part of Highgate Cemetery, we encounter the shockingly large, impressive, and imposing mausoleum of Julius Beer, and that's what it says right above the door there. Now, this is one of the absolute saddest stories in any cemetery that I can think of. It has windows, and we are absolutely invited to look inside if we wish. Julius Beer was a German Jew from Frankfurt who came to London and worked as a money raiser in the city. And with investors pooling their money to pay for large projects, he was able to amass a great fortune, one of the wealthiest private individuals in the country. He married an English wife called Teresa, and they bought the Observer newspaper, which tragically, their daughter Ava died of scarlet fever at just 8 years old in an outbreak that killed 23,000 people in 1875. Julius Beer and his wife were understandably absolutely devastated. The first place that they placed their daughter was here inside the Catacombs, because at the time, this was the most impressive place in the cemetery. But over the next few years, they would spend £50,000, which was the price of the most expensive houses in London at the time, to create this mausoleum. They originally wanted George Gilbert Scott, the architect of these famous buildings, but they ended up going to his son, John Aldred Scott. And then this moving statue was carved by Henry Hugh Armstead, a sculptor who was inspired by the pre-Raphaelites. The mother modeled for the angel, and the face of the girl was based on a death mask taken. As a new mother myself, this is unimaginably heartbreaking. I have a hard time even telling this story. You can see here we're walking now, we can see the top of the Circle of Lebanon again. Another very impressive mausoleum here. Henry Eaton, Lord Chalesmore, who was a silk merchant. Very grand. Let's go find one of the most beautiful plots in all of Highgate Cemetery, and that's saying a lot. Here she is, just coming up on my right-hand side. This grave belongs to a woman called Mary Nichols, and believe it or not, it lay completely hidden by a blanket of ivy until the 1980s, and it was then rediscovered by a photographer called John Gay. Like me, he was utterly besotted with this magical place. As you can see, the sculpture is meant to look like a bed of clouds with a sleeping angel nestled on top. I hope it looks beautiful on film because it is so stunning in person. Mary Nichols died in 1909 of diabetes and heart failure. You can see here it says, "In ever loving memory of Mary, the darling wife of Arthur Nichols, and fondly loved mother of their only son Harold, who fell asleep 7th May 1909. She's joined here in this family vault only by her infant grandson Dennis, who passed away in 1916. They're the only two inside. Mary's tomb is clearly something special, and it's located on a key avenue within the cemetery, which should tell you something about her family's wealth and stature. Her husband was a banker. And alas, just as we witnessed with Mary Emden, widows move on. Her husband Arthur remarried within a year, and he's buried with his next wife, Alice, at another of the Magnificent Seven, Brompton Cemetery, under an Art Deco-inspired monument. Let me know if you'd be interested in the future in a similar tour of Brompton. Oh, I always like seeing busts. Here we go. The face of who's inside. Oh, some damage to his nose here. Maybe done in the 1960s. This is Joseph Hodgson, Esquire, formerly of Birmingham. Oh, survived his beloved wife only one day. They say that when an old elderly married couple goes, often the other goes, and her name was Mary Jane Morton. Oh, I just love the way these gnarled roots look on top of this column here. This is affectionately known as the horse grave, and you can see why. It's the grave of John Atchler, who was the horse slaughterer to Queen Victoria. It's kind of a dubious honor, isn't it? Everything was reused. He was very good at making money, and his offices were near Smithfield Market, the meat market. And that's probably why this horse doesn't look too happy. Poor chappie. But I promised you another animal monument. And that, of course, is this beautiful boy here. This is a huge bull mastiff dog, and his name is Lion. And you can see his owner there, Thomas Sayers. He was a bare knuckle fighter, which was illegal but enormously popular. A lot of pastimes are like that. He was only 5'3", but he must have been a tough little guy at a time that they didn't separate bare knuckle fighting by weight or class or height. I mean, he would have been a real tough you-know-what. And he won a lot of money doing so, enough that he was able to retire and manage his own pub for the remainder of his life. Now, when he died, it's said that 100,000 people lined the route from Camden Town to Highgate Cemetery. And Nero here had his own special carriage. Now, you've probably seen pictures of Victorians in their mourning wear, lots of black and lace and extravagant veils. Well, Nero here had a special carriage lined with black crepe. Nope, nothing unsettling about that. Now, the rain has picked up a little bit, so I've got my hood on, but that's okay because we're nearing the end of our tour. We're just walking down the quite uneven, narrow little Faraday path, and you can probably guess who that's named after. Scientist Michael Faraday, who will be the final grave that we'll visit on our tour. Some areas of the path are blocked off, not because they're necessarily dangerous because of the graves, but because they're dangerous because of the bees. Yes, that's true. There's actually beehives kept here at Highgate Cemetery, and certain times of year they sell the honey in the gift shop. That's a good gift for the morbidly inclined on your next Christmas list. Before we get to Faraday's grave, we can come across quite a strange sight. this ultra modern glass house right on the edge of Highgate Cemetery. I know there's something we could probably say about people who live in glass houses, but I really like this house quite a bit. I'm glad they didn't try to build some kind of Victorian pastiche Gothic castle, but I do like that they also have a sense of humor. Private home, not part of cemetery, occupants alive, not part of zoo, occupants are human. Thank you for not staring or photographing. I think a distance shot of their house is fine, but I'm not going to peer into their windows. But here we get into an even more narrow part of the path. Now, 2 acres of Highgate Cemetery was set aside for dissenters. These weren't necessarily people who didn't believe in Christianity. They just practiced different forms of it. So Methodists, Quakers, and in this case, Sandemanians. Now, Sandemanians are not very common anymore, if at all, but this was an extremely pious religious sect that didn't believe in dancing, singing, or even in praying out loud. And this was the kind of religious denomination that Michael Faraday belonged to. And here's his grave. I've heard that he was actually offered to be interred in Westminster Abbey with Charles Darwin and Isaac Newton, but he declined and instead chose to be buried here with other people of his Sandemanian faith. Michael Faraday is one of the most important British scientists in history, and one of the most important scientists full stop. It's said that Albert Einstein kept a picture of Faraday on his own desk. Faraday's investigations into electromagnetism continue to be important today, but I'm afraid you can't ask me any further questions about that. Social scientist, not hard scientist. Now we're continuing to make our way down the Faraday path. And we're going to come to the end of our tour in just a few moments. Well, that's the end of our tour of the western side of Highgate Cemetery. I hope you can tell just how much I've enjoyed showing you around here, and I'll see you next time I'm at the cemetery, the east side of Highgate, which again I'll be posting next week.